Hi, my name is Zubin Pratap, and I'm here to talk to you about some of the most common questions I get about my career transition from a corporate lawyer for more than 12 years to a software engineer, including at Google. Now, I've written a few blogs about this journey, and this is also an opportunity for me to address some of the main questions that people have asked. It's very important that I emphasize right up the front that these are questions that are not in any particular order. They're just questions that people have raised at various points of time, and I've sort of grouped them into broad themes. So the 15 questions that I'll cover are not in any particular order of importance or otherwise. They're just questions that are very commonly asked. Another thing that's worth keeping in mind is that not everybody needs to become a professional software engineer. A lot of people just need to be technical enough to achieve certain goals that they may have. For example, to be a product manager at a tech company, or a technical writer, or even in some cases, teaching others to code. You do not need to be a professional level software engineer in order to achieve these goals. You also do not need to be a professional software engineer if all you're interested in doing is becoming your own technical co-founder or starting a startup and building your first MVP. These are different levels of technical skill, and ultimately it depends on what your goals are. So, having said all that, let's get into the top 15 questions I get. Number 1, I want to become a coder. I want to learn to code. How do I do it? I've got to say that though this question is the one I probably receive the most often, I'm not convinced it's the most useful question to ask. Asking, how do I become a coder, or how do I learn to code, is a bit like saying, how do I learn music, or how do I become a musician? Almost everything that's going to be useful to you will depend on going a little bit deeper into that question. If you want to be a musician, it's not enough to just know I want to be a musician or an athlete. You've got to know what kind of music instrument, or what kind of musician, or what kind of skills you need, or if it's sports, which sport you want to be an athlete in. And it's the same principle with coding. It's not enough to say I want to learn to code. You need to be very specific about what kind of goal you want to achieve, because a kind of coding is just a tool, right? Learning how to write JavaScript or Python or SQL or whatever it is, these are just tools to help you achieve the actual outcome. So the real question that you should be asking is, for a given goal, which I'm really clear on, what skills do I need to achieve? And that includes what coding skills. Because some goals will require not just coding skills, but other ancillary or surrounding skills to also be developed by you. So if you want to learn to code, you need to be very clear why you want to learn to code. What is your goal? Once you work that out, you need to be very specific on the necessary tools that you need to pick up in order to achieve that goal. And that becomes your path to learning to code. Question 2, how long does it take to learn X or Y or Z or whatever it is? Again, the answer is, how fast do you move? Now, I know people have made it a virtue to be smart and learn quickly and all the rest of that, but let me assure you that most people take way longer to learn than they expect. The question of how long does it take to learn X or Y or Z can only be meaningfully answered once we know two things. How much do you know right now, or what's your starting level of knowledge? And how much time can you dedicate consistently to getting the outcome? There is a third question that's worth answering, which is, how much time does it take on average for someone to get good at a certain skill? For example, when I was teaching myself to code, and I should add here that I tried to teach myself to code 3 different times and failed, and succeeded on the 4th time. On the free code camp site, to get a certain certification, it tells you about how many hours on average it takes. That is really useful information, because using that information, we can just do a bit of simple math. If it takes 500 hours, for example, to get a skill X or a certification Y, and I only do 10 hours a week, that means it's going to take me 50 weeks in order to get that skill or certification. So the answer to how long does it take to learn X or Y is, on average, how long it takes to get that skill, and how long it takes you depends on how many hours you put in every day. Now, those who put in more hours per day are obviously going to make faster progress. It's like, how fast are you traveling to get to your destination? If you're taking an aircraft, you're going to get there a lot faster, whereas if you're taking a ship or you're driving there, you're going to be slower. So the distance to be traveled is about the same. However, how you travel or how fast you learn or how many hours a day you do is actually the real determinant for how soon you get to your destination. Question 3. I don't have a computer science degree or formal education. Can I still be a developer? 100% yes. That's the short answer. I'm living proof. But I wasn't the first one to do it. I learned from other people that it was possible. So 100% you do not need a formal degree. So the question is, in what contexts would a formal degree or a computer science degree still be useful? Well, in general, there's no harm getting these degrees. They can only help you, but they're not necessary and they're not sufficient unless you're planning to take up the sort of work that's going to be very research intensive, quite advanced in theory, pushing the boundaries. So one example of that is in the big tech companies, for example, the Googles and Facebooks and Amazons of the world. They tend to have a section of the software engineering community in those companies that are dedicated to R&D, research and development, and absolutely pushing the frontier of knowledge. Those folks typically tend to be incredibly deeply academic PhD type people who obviously have computer science formal education. For the rest of us who just developing products or developing software tools, etc., it's more than enough to just know how to use the tools and learn on the job. Question number 4. I don't have a background in the software world. How do I get my first job? This is an excellent question. Ultimately, the reason why we're teaching ourselves these skills is to have some sort of economic value from it, whether it's a startup, whether it's a tech-related job, whether it's a software engineer or a developer job. Ultimately, the reason we're trying to teach ourselves to code or whatever skill it is so that it brings us some economic value. Now, if you don't have a background in that industry, yes, it's a little bit harder, but you must understand why it's harder before you can solve the problem. I've been in 3 industries in my career. Over the last 18 years, I've been in law, I've been in the business and management side, I've done my little startup thing for a while in there, and I also have done software engineering professionally. Let me tell you what's common in all these industries. Ultimately, a hiring manager, when they're evaluating a candidate, is doing so from the point of view of, I need a certain kind of skill because I have a task or an outcome that my business needs, and therefore I need to find the one candidate or the 2 candidates who are the most well suited to helping me achieve that outcome. That's it. No matter which industry it is, a hiring manager is looking at candidates to see, can this candidate do what I need them to do to get my outcomes? Now, if you don't have prior industry knowledge, what that means is that the hiring manager is then looking at you and saying, this is a bit of a risky proposition. Now, if you do not have prior industry background or experience, you need to demonstrate to the hiring manager that you are still capable of achieving their objectives. In other words, the fact that you don't have an industry background or experience is not a reason to disqualify you. That does mean, though, that it's shifting the responsibility of that onto you. So, where you don't have prior experience in that industry, you can expect it to be harder, but you can also work at developing a narrative, a strategy, and a set of skills that are well matched to the company you're applying to. And then it's on you to explain to the hiring manager and prove to them that your lack of direct industry experience is irrelevant for the kind of job that they're hiring you for, because you happen to have the necessary skills and knowledge. That's all you got to do. Easier said than done, totally agreed. But the point is that it's possible, and I've done it in 3 different industries. So it's just a system of knowing how to communicate that. Question 5, this is the one that I think affects a lot of us, is I feel like an imposter. How do I deal with imposter syndrome? Well, there are 2 ways to deal with imposter syndrome. One, and I think the most helpful, is to realize that it's universal. Everybody feels it. And the second is to realize that you shouldn't place too much importance on it. But you can only do that effectively when you truly internalize and understand the first point, which is that everyone feels it. Now, let me give you some more context and substantiate why I say everybody feels this. Like I said, I've been in 3 different industries, and whether I'm the candidate or the hiring manager, I have seen very senior people in all these industries still doubt themselves, still struggle with the question of whether or not they are truly going to be able to achieve their outcomes. If imposter syndrome is so rampant, is so prevalent, it's part of the human condition, then we really should not put so much importance on it. In some senses, I've come to regard feeling like an imposter as evidence that I'm operating outside my comfort zone, which means I am growing and developing. The only time I don't feel imposter syndrome is when I'm not growing and developing. If I'm feeling comfortable, that means I have a certain level of mastery or comfort or expertise, which means I'm not growing. Nothing wrong with expertise, but nothing wrong with the imposter syndrome either, because it means you're growing. Also, don't pay attention to it just exactly the same way that you don't pay too much attention to your shadow. It's just something that's there with you at all times. And likewise, the imposter syndrome, that voice in your head, is going to be there a lot as well. Don't let it get to you. Realize that even the people you look up to have experienced it and will continue to experience it. So if they're feeling it, you're going to feel it too. It's a natural process of your development. It's a natural part of your growing and improving your skills. Once you realize that imposter syndrome is simply evidence of growth, you stop taking it so seriously, and in fact, you just allow it to be there as part of your life. Question number 6. I'd like to transition my career from here to there, like for example, learning to code. Where do I start and what do I need to learn? Well, this is an interesting question, because hidden in it is the assumption that there is a perfect place to start, a very comfortable, convenient, and logical place to start. That's not entirely true. At the end of the day, you need to start wherever you feel most comfortable. Depending on where you are, depending on what your prior experience and your level of knowledge and skill is in the subject that you're trying to pick up, there will be a few places you can start, and only a few of those will feel comfortable and within your reach. I'll give you an example. When I was first trying to teach myself to code, it was because I wanted to build an Android app. I didn't know Java. I didn't know even the basics of programming. I didn't know what an IDE was. I knew that there was the Android framework, or something called a framework, and I knew that there was a language called Java, and the two somehow came together to produce mobile apps for Android. So I went straight into buying and trying to use books on Android development. Needless to say, a month and a half later, I failed, right? I just gave up. I was totally overwhelmed. What I should have done was start with the absolute basics of programming. For example, what is a text editor? What are the basic principles of writing code? Had I started that way, I probably would have realized just how much distance I had to cover before I was ready for mobile development. The advantage of starting from the basics means that you're not going to discourage or overwhelm yourself, and you're going to build up your fundamentals. But the flip side is that you're going to go slower than you secretly want, which means you're more likely to get frustrated or discouraged unless you set good expectations. But the second part of the question is, how much do I learn? Well, there is a tendency for people to try and learn everything that they think is relevant. Just because something is relevant to the subject doesn't mean you need to spend time and effort learning it. If your goal is to start a small startup and build your first MVP, you do not need to learn advanced patterns. You do not need to learn algorithms and data structures. If your job is to get your first developer job, and it's not one of the big tech companies, then you do not need to know algorithms and data structures. Instead, you probably need to know things like the Django framework or the React framework, basic JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. There is a certain core minimum level of skill that you need to acquire in order to achieve your goals. Do not get distracted by all the other stuff that's nice to have that makes you a more sophisticated or advanced developer. You want to do the minimum amount required, not the maximum amount required. Most people get so overwhelmed by trying to learn all sorts of things. One example is one of the people I was coaching wants to be a data scientist and was halfway through picking up the basics of Python, no previous technical background. Unfortunately, this person was also told that to be a really good data scientist, you need to understand compiler level stuff and get to learn things like C, because that what makes you really advanced and efficient and a great data scientist or machine learning engineer. And so that person stopped their Python education about 7 weeks in and switched to C and was really getting quite overwhelmed. And I had to tell and point out that once you finish Python, once you understand the basics of data science, once you get your first 1 or 2 jobs as a data scientist, then when you want to level up, you can look at things like C. But the vast majority of data science practitioners don't need or use C in their daily life. So why are you derailing your education process in doing that? This is an example of wanting to do the minimum required to get to your goal and starting at the smallest possible place where you can find success, the logical next step from wherever you are, and then just repeat that process. Question number 7. What's better? University degree, bootcamp, being self-taught? Again, this question is a little bit deceptive. Ultimately, it doesn't matter how you learned what you learned. As long as you know what you need to know to get the job done, whatever your goal is, that's all that matters. Now, there are advantages to doing it via bootcamp or a degree because they give you structure, they give you accountability, but then there are also disadvantages. They cost a lot of money, you may not be able to work, so you lose income and you have to pay for the tuition fee, and so on and so forth. Being self-taught has its advantages. One, it makes you a much better learner. And I think a lot of people forget that learning how to learn is the most important skill out of all of these, because that's something you'll keep doing during your career. You'll keep having to learn. So being self-taught has a big advantage. It teaches you how to learn. You learn how to learn. But it also has serious disadvantages. It can be quite time-consuming. It can be extraordinarily frustrating. It requires an immense amount of internal direction and initiative and discipline because you don't have a structure or any system of accountability. So being self-taught has advantages, but also serious disadvantages. So ultimately, your choice of how you want to acquire your knowledge is entirely up to you and should be dictated by your circumstances, your financial situation, and your ability to motivate yourself and be disciplined and chase your goals. It doesn't matter whether you go the university route or the bootcamp route or the self-taught route. What matters is what works for you and what can you do. In terms of the job market, yes, having a degree may be a little bit easier because the more traditional way, people are more used to it, and they can take a piece of paper as evidence of knowledge, even though these days that is less true than ever before. Boot camps also have the advantage of making sure that everyone has a certain minimum baseline level of knowledge, and if the boot camp has a good reputation, they give you the structure so you can prove your knowledge out into the market by doing projects or whatever it is. And being self-taught can be challenging because they look at your resume and they say, hang on, how do you know this? How do we know you know this? But the good thing is in engineering, a lot of the jobs require some sort of test. So it doesn't matter what your background is. If you do the test right and you handle the technical interviews right, clearly you know what they need you to know. So that's why I don't think this question's that relevant these days. And you do whatever you need to do to get to your goals. It doesn't matter what the rest of the world says. Question number 8. This is the question I get a lot, especially having joined Google. So the question is, how do you get into a place like Microsoft, Google, Netflix, Amazon, whatever it is? Now, I totally understand that getting into these big companies is a dream for many people. It was a dream for me as well. It is a very big task. And no matter what people tell you, there is a little bit of luck involved, right? So take my example. For me to clear the Google interview process, I needed a combination of my skill, my knowledge, the right interviewers on the right days, and my other competitors, other candidates didn't do as well as I did. Not all of these things are in my control. In fact, most of these things are not in my control. So while I understand how attractive it is to focus on these companies, I personally think it is a mistake to make it a big part of your goals. Certainly when you're learning, when you're teaching yourself, and when you're looking for your first few jobs, your focus should be on getting as good as you can for those jobs. If you try and focus too early on getting into these big companies, I believe you're setting yourself up for a lot of disappointment and discouragement. First and foremost, these companies are extremely advanced and extremely competitive to get into. Secondly, the level of skill they require is very, very high, and it takes a certain amount of time and training to get to that level of skill. Thirdly, not everybody is going to be happy at these companies. However, if your goal is to become a software developer or be in the technical/startup world, there are thousands of companies to choose from. Why should you limit yourself only to the top 5? Sure, you can apply to these companies 2, 3, 4, 5 years into your technical career. But for the first few years, don't even think about them. Instead, focus on getting the basic level of skill required to get your first job, then you get paid to learn more, then get your second job, and you build up and stack your skill and knowledge until you're ready to prepare for these big tech companies. So my honest advice to you is, at the beginning, don't spend too much time thinking about these big tech companies. Instead, focus on learning as much as you can, doing whatever is necessary to get that next job that is within your reach, and then learning more and more on the job. But to directly answer the question of how you get into them, it does require a fair bit of training and a lot of preparation of computer science topics. Keep in mind that most other companies do not require that level of computer sciencey algorithms and data structure type preparation. Most companies will test you on the actual tools that you use in the job and less so on some of the complex computer science problems. That's why going after the big tech companies requires a different kind of preparation than most other companies require. Question 9 is closely related to the previous one, which is, how do I crack the coding interview? Again, the answer is preparation, practice, and really understanding the intuition behind some of the computer science theory, some of the problems that you're going to deal with, etc. Most people tend to focus on practicing so much that they sort of memorize the solutions to, lead code questions or whatever it is. While that can be a strategy that'll get you through, it's not a good strategy to be effective and to be a good learner. It's much better for you to understand, when a given problem is presented to you, what class of problems that particular problem falls into. What kind of data structures and algorithms are relevant to solve this kind of a problem? These are certain patterns that you start to see. It's really important that you build an intuition for the class of problems, because that then will dictate your approach to solving that problem. If you memorize or try to do it by rote, or you're just completely focused on the implementation for that particular problem without understanding the concept theory and intuition behind it, then you won't be able to what's known as generalize your solution to a broader class of problems. Ultimately, these algorithms and data structures and computer science techniques are just tools to solve problems. Your ability to recognize the problem will decide which tools you choose to apply to that problem. And that's really the skill you want to develop, to be able to recognize the class of the problem and then select from your toolbox which tools are the best suited to that kind of problem. The other thing to think about is, a lot of people focus so much on cracking the coding interview, but almost no one out there talks about how do you even get invited to these interviews, what I call opportunity generation. When I finished teaching myself to code, I had already put in place for several months a campaign of preparing myself for the job market. It had nothing to do with my coding and technical skills. It had to do with understanding the job market in the area I was in, targeting the kind of companies that were right for me, which also meant targeting the kind of companies where I had a passing chance of getting a job. Had I in for a Google or a Facebook right after I taught myself to code, my odds were so small of getting in. By choosing very carefully the companies that actually apply to, I optimized my chances. In fact, I optimized it so sharply that I applied for 4 roles and I got 4 offers. That was because I chose companies very, very specifically using all my 18 years of experience, both as a hiring manager and as a candidate, to understand what sort of roles I'd be best suited to. So remember, opportunity generation is critical. There's no point being a gun coder, there is no point being a competitive level programmer or a lead code genius if you're not able to get invited to interviews. So remember, part of the process is being able to get the interview opportunity, and then your technical skills and your ability to crack the interview will come into play. Question 10. Can I become my own technical co-founder, and if so, how? Well, short answer again, yes, 100% I did it. When I first started out on my startup, I was non-technical, so I hired a team. Once the team built the product, it went to market, and I realized I really need technical skills because I had to constantly maintain and update and fix bugs, and that was costing a lot of money. It so happened at that point in time that somebody joined me as a technical co-founder, but then a few months later they quit for personal family reasons, and so there I was left again with no technical co-founder. That's when I went back to teaching myself to code for the 4th time, and this time I actually managed to do it. But the important lesson here is, after I was technical enough, I was no longer afraid to start building my own MVPs. I was no longer afraid to start building my own little tools and projects that could become, in theory, the seed to a business someday. Now, I haven't gone down the startup route since then, but I do know that if I choose to now, it's pretty straightforward for me to start and build a prototype if I wanted to. So why is it useful to learn to code? Well, as a non-technical founder, I spent years looking for good technical co-founders. And then I chanced upon this blog by Sam Altman, who is the ex-partner, or maybe he's still the partner at Y Combinator, and also one of the founding members, I think, of OpenAI. Now, he had written this blog, I think, back in 2013, 2014, and he basically said, it's probably faster for you to teach yourself enough code to build your MVP than it is to find a technical co-founder who you like, who you can trust, who has the same work ethic as you, who sees the same vision you do, who's interested in the product, and is willing to join you. Like, the combination of all those factors is so rare and so unusual that it'll take a ton of time or luck to get that outcome. However, instead of spending 3 years looking for a technical co-founder, if you spend 2 years teaching yourself to code, you'd probably get better results. There's another thing that I discovered after I became technical. Once I started understanding technology a bit more and becoming a little bit of a coder myself, the interactions I had with technical people improved. So much so that it was much easier for me to attract the attention and interest of potential technical co-founders after I was technical, which is kind of ironic. When I wasn't technical and I really needed their help, it was really hard to get them to pay any attention to me. The less I needed their help and the more I could do it myself, the more of them were interested in joining me. And that's because engineers get sort of hit on all the time to start a tech company or to be a technical co-founder or to build this MVP in a weekend because, it's a really easy thing to do. Engineers are sick of hearing that, and they find that all the time, and they're not interested in working in these kind of projects unless they know the other person is committed. One way to know or to demonstrate that you're committed is if you've actually learned enough of their tools to talk to them about it. So the moment I was able to spin up my own MVPs, suddenly other technical people were interested in collaborating. And ultimately, that made it easier for me to work with other engineers and get better. Now, if I want to start a tech company, it's much easier for me to reach into my network. People are more likely to pay attention to me or to at least hear me out and give me feedback, maybe even come on board and collaborate. I just have a better network because I'm technical. Likewise, you can totally get technical enough to build your first MVP, especially if it's something that can use a mix of no code, low code, and custom code tools, right? So you can totally start an MVP up with about a year's worth of training if you're willing to do that for yourself. The other advantage is by developing these technical skills, you actually have skills that have value in the marketplace. So like me, if your startup fails, you can go to the market and choose, do I want to go back to my old career or do I want to start this new career in engineering, which is exactly what I did. When I shut down my startup, I had a choice. I could go back to being a lawyer, I could go back to commercial roles and product and stuff, or I could keep coding and become an engineer. And that's what I ended up doing. But that was only possible because I'd become technical. So 100% you can be your own technical co-founder, and there are huge advantages with being technical enough to become your own technical co-founder, even if you don't end up proceeding with your startup idea. Question level. I get stuck into tutorial hell, endless tutorials, and I often don't complete what I start. Now, this is a very, very, very common problem. And at the heart of it, the tendency to start something and not complete it is because there is a gap between our expectations of the process and what actually happened. Let me be a little more specific. When I was teaching myself to code the first 2 or 3 times, I would look at a resource, whether it was a blog or a tutorial or a video or a course or whatever it was, and I would be really excited because I knew that if I did it, I'd get these skills. What I did not realize was it was hard to stick to it. It was hard to complete those courses. I'd so often get stuck and frustrated and overwhelmed and irritated and annoyed because things wouldn't work. Or what the instructor would say would make perfect sense on the screen, but when I started to implement it myself, it just wouldn't work. Or things had changed between when the tutorial was prepared and when I was trying to do it. And so I was stuck in this hellish situation of all these errors and not knowing what they meant or how to diagnose them. So I totally get it. In those moments, I would switch. I would assume that there was a problem with the course or the instructor or the material, and therefore I would also assume that there was something better out there, and then I'd start looking for it. But here's what I think is actually going on. When our expectations of a course or a bit of material or a resource are not met, we assume the problem is with the resource that we're using. We assume it's a problem with the instructor or the material. What if the problem's with us? What if it is our expectations that aren't correct? So if I think it's going to be easier, faster, more intuitive than it actually is, my expectations are not going to be met. So I'm going to feel frustrated and discouraged, and I'm going to keep hopping around looking for that perfect resource that'll teach me magically what I need to know. But I don't think that exists. The 4th time when I taught myself to code and succeeded, I made a simple promise to myself. I said, look, no matter how rubbish this experience, no matter how shitty it is and how frustrating it is, one rule, I won't quit till I finish it. Maybe it won't give me the results I'm secretly hoping for, but in completing it, I will get better than I was yesterday. Also, I realized that every time I switched, I made it more likely that I was going to switch again. Every time I gave up on a particular resource, I was much more likely to give up on the next one. I was developing the habit of quitting a resource simply because it wasn't easy enough for me. That is not a habit you want to carry into learning any new skill, especially development, because you are going to spend a lot of time in broken land when things just don't work and you're not sure how to solve it. So you need to get really good at Googling for solutions. Every time you switch, you're effectively giving yourself permission to not stick to it till you get a solution. And in that is an assumption that there's an easy way somewhere else, but it may not be the case. So if you're in tutorial hell, or you're not able to stick to a given resource until you finish it, strongly encourage you, change that habit. Maybe the problem is not with the resource, maybe the problem is with your expectations. Now I know that whether it's Coursera, Udemy, or any one of these things, Heck, even my YouTube videos, most people will not stick to the end of a 12-minute video. No matter how much information I put in there, most people will drop off. That is part of the tendency where people expect to get some sort of magical silver bullet or magical instant result. The same thing with Udemy or Coursera, all these courses, there are low course completion rates across the board. And that's because people start with excitement, encounter difficulties, their motivation levels start to drop, then they get more and more frustrated, and then they assume there's something wrong with the course or that this is not the right course for them. No, the answer is that they didn't realize how hard it's going to be. So recognize it's going to be hard. Recognize you're going to be frustrated a lot. It's going to take longer than you realized. It's going to be harder than you're secretly hoping it's going to be. But that's just the path everybody has to walk on before they get the learning they're seeking. So don't stop just because you're not getting the results you're wanting yet. Question number 12. Which online resources are best for self-taught coders? Again, implicit in this question is that there is a best magical unicorn-like secret tool out there that's going to solve all their problems. There isn't. Now, I'm not going to repeat everything I said in the previous answer, but the expectation that there is this one magical course that'll solve everything, the one best tool, is a myth. Here's the quickest way to think about it. Your learning style is exclusive to you. It's unique to you. You have to figure out what works for you. And that may take a process of trial and error, which can be longer and more frustrating than you bargained for. For me, for example, I learn best from video and then from following 2 to 3 different sources of information on the same topic. Most people don't have the patience to do that. They do one blog or they do one course in React and then they stop. When I was teaching myself React, I did 3 different courses, plus some YouTube videos, plus read the React documentation. I was going over the same thing over and over again from different angles. And that took a lot of time compared to just doing one thing. So in terms of the best tool out there to teach yourself, there is none. But there is a best tool for you. Usually it's a video or a book or whatever style that works for you. And for me, what really worked, the breakthrough moment, was getting paid and free mentorship from different people. If there were people in my network who could coach me and help me, great. If I couldn't find them and I was stuck on a problem, I would pay someone a little bit of money on an hourly rate or whatever to help unblock and coach me through that. That was the best investment I ever made because it made me save a lot of time and not give up. So the best tools are the ones that work for you, and don't be afraid to spend whatever resources you have to achieve the outcome. Question 13. How do I learn algorithms and data structures? Well, this is again another one of those questions where I think people think that learning algorithms and data structures is absolutely essential to have a developer role. So I'm going to say something that's going to be quite controversial, no doubt, and probably polarizing, but this is what I truly believe. I believe the vast majority of developer roles, and if you're not going to go for professional software engineering roles, especially true then, don't require you to know algorithms and data structures particularly well. Look, most languages come with basic data structures like a string or an array or list or dictionary or hash map or object, whatever language you're using. These are data structures that come with the language, right? Those are usually more than enough for the vast majority of use cases and certainly for your first developer job. The overemphasis on algorithms and data structures comes from this big narrative in the market that you need to be at one of the big tech companies to be taken seriously as a developer. That is absolutely not true. In fact, I'd say the opposite. The more you overemphasize the big tech companies as being the only places you can become an engineer or get a good developer job, the more likely you are to get frustrated, to get discouraged and demotivated and give up. Instead, what I would say is focus on learning the skills that your target job requires. If your target job requires algorithms and data structure, sure, do it. If it doesn't require it, don't waste time on it, no matter what the rest of the world says. Sure, they may say you're not as good as an engineer as you ought to be, or a good engineer would definitely know algorithms and data structures. Maybe, maybe not. If your role doesn't require it, if your target job doesn't require it, then you don't need it yet. Do what's required, do the minimum required to get to your goal, and then after that, build up your knowledge. If you do want to learn algorithms and data structures, the best thing is practice and understanding the intuition. I think I've talked about this in one of the previous answers. Understand the concepts, don't just memorize the implementation, but that comes with practice. So really spending time with the problem is very, very important. And the last thing on this point about algorithms and data structures is people try and smash it out in 3 months. You're much better off spending 2 years doing 1 or 2 problems a week, which means at the end of 2 years, you would have done over 104 problems. Do it that way because you're not taking too much pressure on that way. You're being consistent and you're also learning as you go along in a relaxed, steady, consistent way while holding down a developer job and learning all the other tools. So it's much better to play the long game when it comes to developing these kind of skills. Question 14. I'm a bit of a slow learner, or I'm not learning this fast enough, or it takes me a long time to learn this. That's okay. Everybody learns differently, whether they're teaching themselves a new skill, whether they're in a new job or an old job, it doesn't matter. I am not the fastest learner at some things. There are other things that I'm a very fast learner. For example, some of my musician friends are very good at the music theory and at playing things. Really good. And when we play the guitar together, we jam together, it's very clear that they're better musicians than I am. But I am better at listening to a song and being able to figure it out without reading music. I don't know how to read music, but I can listen to a song and figure it out faster than some of them can, even though they're better musicians than me. Now, my point here is don't worry about your learning speed. There is no real such thing. You're not competing with anyone. It's much more important for you to be slow and steady and get to your goal than it is to get there blazingly fast, because chances are you're not going to get there blazingly fast. So you take the time you need to learn whatever you need to learn. If it takes you 6 months longer than somebody else, so what? Over the course of your lifetime, as long as you get to the goal, you're not really going to mind if you get there 6 months or 1 year after somebody else did, right? That's irrelevant. But I get it. Everybody's in a hurry. Everybody wants to get there sooner rather than later. But you will get there, provided you don't quit and you stay consistent. So if you take off all the unnecessary pressure, you're much more likely to get there. So don't worry about the learning speed. If you're finding that you're not learning as fast as you'd like to, experiment with other modalities, other types of learning, and find the system that works for you. Once you find it, stick to it. Don't be in a rush. The last question, question number 15, this one makes me laugh, is, am I too old to learn to code at 25 or 27 or 29 or 31 or whatever? Well, obviously not, because I taught myself when I was 37 and 38. So 100% the age doesn't matter. In fact, one of my students was a retired nurse. She was a nurse for many, many, many years. And she taught herself to code in her, I think, early 60s and is a freelance developer part-time now. So clearly age is not a thing, right? It just doesn't matter. Having said that, often I find that what this question really means is, can I learn to code at any stage in my life? And that's regardless of age. So if you're in a situation where you have a family that you need to take care of, maybe you're living with your older parents, or you've got a wife and kids and you don't have a lot of time, then yes, your circumstances may make it harder. This has nothing to do with your age, has nothing to do with your ability. It has to do with recognizing your circumstances. So the more free time you can pull out from your life, keeping in mind that everybody on the planet, whether you're Elon Musk or whether you're the guy next door, everybody is only 24 hours in a day, right? The question is, how do you fill those 24 hours? If you have demands in your time and you can't make sacrifices, or you're unwilling to make sacrifices, then obviously you're going to travel to your destination slower. It's going to take you longer to get there. If you're able to pull out the time, then you'll get there faster, regardless of your circumstances. Now, I for a long time thought I'm one of the few lawyers in the world who've taught themselves to code. It turns out, no. I think I've met 15 or 16 lawyers who've taught themselves to code, and these are very, very busy professions. And unlike me, these are people who have many kids, and so have less time on their hands, and they've still been able to do it. Now, it may have taken them 3 years, whereas it took me 6 to 7 months of full-time study. But that's okay, right? They eventually got there too. So the question is, how do you make it fit in your life? Regardless of which stage in life you're at, there is a way for you to fit it in. The problem is, it may require a lot of sacrifice. It may require you to reduce your TV watching like I did to 90 minutes in a week. That's all the TV I allowed myself to watch. It may mean that when you go out for dinner or lunch or whatever it is with friends, you cut it down to an hour and a half. That's what I was doing. I went from 4-hour long lunches on Sundays with my friends to 2 hours and I'm out, right? And I did that for over a year. Once you make these sacrifices and you take away the time from other things in your life and you completely devote it to the goal that you're committed to getting, you will get there. Then the age or the stage in your life or your busyness won't matter. Something's got to give. Everything's a trade-off. So when you take time out for coding, it means you've taken time away from something else. And if you're not willing to take time away from other things to put into your main goal, you're obviously going to get to your goal much slower. So it doesn't matter what age you are, you can absolutely do it. Okay, so that was quite a lot, and I hope some of that gave you sort of insight and there was some value that you got out of that long conversation we've just had. Know that I'm always here for you guys. There's ways to get in touch with me on the internet, and if you look at the free code camp blogs that I've written, there's usually contact details at the end of it. You can follow me on Twitter. You can check out my YouTube channel. It's quite new, but I'm going to keep adding more content there for people like you who want to know how to transition careers to some sort of coding related career. Believe that it's possible, and then you'll find a way. And if there's any way that I can help you, don't hesitate to reach out. I really believe that people can change their lives if they commit themselves to it, and coding is one way, but not the only way to do it, especially if you're looking for a certain kind of income level or a certain security for your family. So there are lots of good things to be had, and if you ever need any help, reach out and I'll see what I can do for you. All the very best.